Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Mefaf. We're going to get started with a quick review of the last part that we did in yesterday's daf, which is this Machloket Rabbi Akiva and Ben Nanas about which one is essential, which one can block the other from happening, the two sheep of the Shtei Alechem Korban or the bread. So if, remember, you're supposed to bring a Korban, two kfasim together with bread. There's also all sorts of other animals that go along with this, but we're going to talk about that later. Why are these the two that are interconnected and not the rest of them? But we learned that Rabbi Akiva said if there's no bread, you can't bring the sheep, but if there are no sheep, you can bring the bread. And Ben Nanas said the opposite. Okay, so now we're going to get back to, we're going to go to start with Rabbi Yochanan, the very end, the last few words of Mem Ham Bet. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hakol Mudim, but both of them agree if they were together, okay, this word zika, okay, huskiku comes from zika. You might remember from Yavamo, which is that once the husband dies and they have no children, the wife is already kind of somewhat connected already to the yabam, which have all sorts of ramifications, which we're not going to discuss right now. But if they were put together and kind of aligned with each other, meaning some later stage, which we're going to talk about exactly what that is, shemak v'inzetze, at that point, if you had them all together and then one of them gets lost or something happens, then you can't continue with the sacrifice. You have to bring, you have to start from the beginning. Ve'ezehu zikasha lehem, what actually binds these two things together? Shchita. Okay, the Gemara says it's the slaughtering. When you slaughter the two sheep, that basically connects the bread to the sheep. And from that point on, if you then lose part of one of them, right, something happens, it's a problem. Amar Ula. Now Ula says, Ba'u b'ma'arava, in Israel, they ask the following question. Tshnufa osazika o eno osazika? Does the waving, okay, now when does the waving happen? The waving actually happens once before, once after, but they're talking about the first waving. First you wave the animals, the two animals together with the breads, then you slaughter the animal, then you take two parts of the animal, the breast and the thigh, and you wave them together with the breads again. But we're talking about the earlier one. So they say, does that make zikah or does it not? Okay? Does the waving, because it's also an action where you put them together. So pshat le'mid Rabbi Yochanan, so they say, why don't you answer it from Rabbi Yochanan? As Rabbi Yochanan said, Ta'amar Rabbi Yochanan, shchita usa zikah. Now, if shchita is the later stage, and that is what makes them connected, then obviously it's not the earlier stage, otherwise Rabbi Yochanan would have said the earlier stage. Michlal, from there you can infer that Tshnufa eno osa zikah, so from there you can learn that the waving of it is not what makes zikah. So then they say, no. What we really were asking is, did Rabbi Yochanan gufa kame b'ayli? They were really asking the question about Rabbi Yochanan, meaning there's two ways to understand Rabbi Yochanan. You could say like this. Option one, mifsha pshita le Rabbi Yochanan d'shchita osa zikah, u'tshnufa eno osa zikah. That's option one, which is what the way they understood it right now, which is, if shchita is the thing that makes them connected, then it's certainly not an earlier stage. And then shnufa wouldn't do it. O dilma, shchita pshitale, or maybe when Rabbi Yochanan said it, what he said was, I know that at least when you get to the point of shchita, for sure they're connected. But shnufa masapkale, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's even earlier. Okay, and that's the explanation. And that's the question, basically. Is it this or that? Answer, teiku, we don't have an answer. Okay, now but basically it seems like there's two possibilities, either tshnufa or shchita. Now we're going to ask a difficulty on saying it's tshnufa that connects them, and then we're going to ask a difficulty on saying it's shchita that connects them. And again, once they're connected, they're makvim zetze. You can't bring one without the other. So Amar le Rabbi Yehuda bar Chanina le Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua. So he asks, okay, one of them asks the other, V'haki ktiv kodesh yel Hashem lekohen, batar tshnufa ktiv, upliga ben Nanas for Rabbi Akiva. Let's go back to yesterday's sugya. What did we see? The pasuk where we learn that only one is affecting the other, but the other's not affecting that one, meaning if you lose one, you can still do the other, which right now we said is only at an earlier stage, because at a later stage, definitely not. Well, notice where that pasuk comes up. That pasuk says, Kodesh yu Lashem lekohen. That's where we darshan it from that word yihiyu, or maybe from also the Lashem lekohen. And then, if you look at that pasuk, now that's the pasuk that seems to be talking about an earlier stage, before Huzkaku. But the pasuk says, "Ve'nifa kohen otam alechem abikurim." He waves them. T'nufa l'fnei Hashem. They're waved before God. Al shnei akfasim, with, right, the bread is waved together with the sheep. Kodesh yu l'Hashem l'kohen. So what do you see? Your tnufa is done, and then it says, but they're still not both ma'akev each other, only one is. Right? And that's the machlok of Rabbi Akiva and Ben Nanas. Which one? But everyone agrees that one of them is not going to be critical. So, and that's batar tnufa k'tiv. That's said after tnufa. So it can't possibly be that opinion is right. To which the counterclaim to this question is, V'lita me'ech, according to what you're saying, okay, Rav Huna Breid Rav Yeshua counters back to Rav Yehuda Bar Chanina, batar tnufa below batar shchita. Now you want to say, right, after tnufa, it's not yet, but after shchita, it is. But wait, elamai lach lememar. In other words, what are we going to say? He says, this pasuk, sorry, I didn't read it right. Lita me'ech, the pasuk is after tnufa. And not after shchita? Of course the pasuk's after shchita. How do we know? Because it says, La kodesh yeh laHashem laKohen. When is it given to the Kohanim? After shchita, obviously. So that pasuk is also talking about after shchita. So now you're going to have a problem. You're going to say, this doesn't work according to the one who says shchita. They're makvin zeh after that. It doesn't work either. So he says, basically, to answer the difficulty, it says, if you're going to say the question's also by shchita, well, elamai lach lememer, you have no choice, but you have to explain this pasuk some other way. Me'ikarakai, the pasuk's really talking about an earlier stage. My kadosh yu laHashem laKohen. So how do you explain then kadosh yu laHashem laKohen, that they're going to be given to the Kohen later, which is after shchita? Davar shesafo laKohen. They're saying ultimately this will be given to the Kohen. Hachanami davar shesafo laKohen. You could say the same thing with the tnufa. That basically this is discussing. Ultimately, it will be waived, but at the earlier stage, it's basically only one is going to be essential to make sure this happens and not the other, and again, debate about which one. So you don't necessarily have to say that this whole pasuk is referring to a later stage. You could say it's really referring to an earlier stage, but makes references to later stages of what will be. Okay. Now, that was the difficulty on Shnufa Osazika. Now we're going to have a question on Shchita Osazika. Shchita Osazika, Uremini, that contradicts the following source. Okay, the topic here, before we read, let's just talk about the topic. The topic here is not the shtei lechem. It's another sacrifice that's brought with bread. That's a Thanksgiving offering. We bring an animal, and with that we bring 40 loaves of bread. Of those 40 loaves, we'll talk about this soon, so I'll already say it now. There's 4 types of breads, and 1 of every 10 is given to the Kohen as a gift, like a truma. So now we're going to say the following. We're going to have 3 scenarios where something goes wrong with the bread. And in each of the 3, there's going to be 9 altogether because we have 3 cases where something goes wrong. And in each case, we're going to have 3 stages at which it goes wrong. And then we're going to have the law in each case. And what we're going to have in the middle of each case, the second option in each of the 3 cases is going to be after they slaughter it, something happens to the bread. And then we're going to see what they say. Now, what you would expect to happen is, according to this, once who's cuckoo and something happens to the bread, right? We said the sheep are gone, right? So in the Toda, it would be the comparison. The animal's gone. You can't do anything with it. And that's not what it's going to say here. So let's read it inside, and it's going to be a problem with all 3 cases, even though there's minor differences between all 3 cases. But on that case, it's very clear. It's going to be the same problem with all 3. Here goes our source. It's a Tosefta. About the Korban Toda. Ad shalosh shachata, if you didn't yet slaughter it, and yet nifas lechma, and the bread breaks, yavi lechem acher v'shochet. So you bring a different loaf, and you slaughter it on that one. You just replace it. Very easily replaceable because, we said until slaughtering, it's not sanctified yet. This bread isn't designated for this offering. Even if you designated it, it doesn't matter. Misha shachatat nifras lachma, that's our case. Once it's slaughtered, that's what we want to be asking about, and the bread breaks, so again you would think, animal disqualified. What does it say? Hadam yizarek. We continue to slaughter to deal with the animal. We sprinkle the blood. Habasar yachel. You can eat the meat. Well, you didn't fulfill your obligation of the Thanksgiving offering because in the end you didn't do everything. And halechem pasul, and the bread is disqualified. But you see here that you continue to go along sacrificing the sacrifice, which is really a question on our topic. Okay, case 2. Nizrak adam. Third stage in case 1 still. Nizrak adam. What if it's already you sprinkle the blood and then the bread breaks? Torem and ashalem ala parus. Well, everything's fine. The bread can break afterwards because everything's been done. but it's now permitted to the owner to eat. 1 out of every 10 has to go to the Kohen. Well, you take from the non-broken ones. Don't give the Kohen the broken piece. Okay. Case 2. Ad shalosh chata. You didn't yet slaughter it, so now we're back to stage 1. It's the same 3 stages: before slaughtering, after slaughtering, and after the blood was sprinkled. So if lo shachata yatsa lachma, the bread goes outside the borders of Jerusalem, which is a disqualifying factor. Remember, the bread can be eaten in all of Jerusalem, like a shlamim, but if it goes outside the walls of Jerusalem, it's a problem. So if before you slaughtered it, it goes out, well, it's not sanctified yet, so it doesn't matter. You can just machnisa v'shochet, just bring it back in and slaughter the animal. Misha shachata, if you slaughter the animal, yatsa lachma, and the bread goes out. Hadam yizarek babasar yachel, same thing. The blood can get sprinkled, the meat can get eaten, but you don't fulfill your obligation, and the bread is disqualified. Nizrak adam torei mimasha b'fnim masha b'chutz. The blood was already sprinkled. Now here there's going to be a minor variation. They actually don't discuss it. But the bread is disqualified because the bread went out of where it still has to be within the walls of Jerusalem. So you actually can't eat that loaf, but you're toreim from what's still inside. Okay, you still give the Kohen from one of the loaves, and you just have less loaves to eat. Okay, third case. Before you even slaughter it, the bread becomes impure. Maybe lechem acher v'shochet. It's fine, right? Just bring a different loaf. You can't use it, but you can replace it. And now slaughter the animal. Misha shachata, if you already slaughtered the animal, nitma lachman, the bread was already impure, right? The bread became impure, after you slaughter it. Hadam yizarek babasar yachel v'yedeni drola. This is going to be different, so let's first explain. The blood gets sprinkled, the meat gets eaten. Now, in the other cases, what do we see? Here's the one minor difference, but for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. But there's one minor difference, which is you can sprinkle the blood, you can eat the meat, and now you're expecting the bread is disqualified, right? And which is also going to be true, but you don't fulfill your obligation. But now they're going to say, here yedeni dro yatsa. You fulfilled your obligation. Why? Because the tzitz atones for a sacrifice that was brought in properly. So you're actually okay with your sacrifice. Still, halechem pasul, the lechem is disqualified, but you actually fulfill your obligation. So this is even more of a question, you could say, although all of them are difficulties. Nizrak adam, if after the blood was sprinkled, then it broke, that it became impure, toremen hatahor ala tameh. Okay, what you do is you just take from the better one, and you give that one to the Kohen, and the one that's tameh, obviously, is disqualified. There's something you could do with it. Okay, now, isak datach. Here comes the difficulty, after we saw that whole long tosefta. If you think that shchita osa zika, that the slaughtering is what makes the zika, then, kevan she'uzkeku zelazeh b'shchita, if salei lechem tipasal nami toda. Well, if the bread got disqualified, the korban toda should also be disqualified, the meat. So how do you go ahead and sprinkle the blood? And how do you even say in the last case that the owner fulfilled their obligation? How can you eat the meat of it? The whole thing. Big question. To which they answer, exception to the rule of a korban toda. We were comparing korban toda to the shtei alechem. Who's to say they're the same? Shani toda is different. De rachmana karya shlamim, because the Torah called it shlamim. Now, it's a type of shlamim, but the point is, it could have just been called a korban toda. Why did they have to say it's a shlamim? Ma shlamim krevim below lechem, av toda kreva below lechem. Just like a shlamim could be brought without bread, because most shlamim don't have bread. So the korban toda could actually be brought without its bread. And that's a unique halacha, and that's where we learn these halachot that we saw in the Tosefta, but this has nothing to do with the shtei alechem, which, by the way, is also called a shlamim, so it's a bit of a question, but it's called a shlamim because that's the type of korban it is. Here, it's called a korban toda. So why do they need to call it shlamim? Must be to teach us this additional element. Okay. Now we're going to move on to questions of Rabbi Yirmiyah, our classic, whether you love him or don't love his questions. But right, a lot of the rabbis didn't love his questions, so don't feel bad if you don't like them. Some people love them because they identify with those kind of questions. Anyway, we're going to have a slew of questions. First, he's going to start with a fact, and then from there, he's going to get off on a question. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, intim tzalomar tnufa usazika. If you want to say that waving them creates the zika, the connection, avad halechem, then you're going to say the following. Avad halechem, the lechem gets destroyed, right, gets lost. Avdu fasim. This is what Rashi said in the first Rashi that I mentioned, that as soon as I'm not sure if I mentioned it was in Rashi, but Rashi at the beginning says, what's whose kikula is that if one gets lost, then the other one is gone. So if you lose the bread, the kvasim are gone. You can't do anything with them. Avdu kvasim, avad alechem. If the sheep get lost, then you're stuck and you can't do the bread. So that's just a given. But if you think the waving doesn't create this zika, this connection between them, what if you brought bread and sheep and you waved them, which didn't make zika yet? Then the bread got lost. So what'd you do? You replaced it. That's what we learned. You could do. If there's no zika yet, you can just replace it. But you already did the waving. So now we want to know, do you have to redo the waving? Because the waving you did was with a different loaf of bread. On the one hand, you did waving. On the other hand, you now replaced it with a different loaf. So, because you got lost, so maybe you have to start from the beginning again. It sounds like the Yom Kippur, if you remember. What if the blood gets spilled in the middle of the sprinkling? Do you have to start from the beginning? Do you have to write all these questions? So, they point out now about his question. Avdu kvasim lo tibayalach. Okay, there's no question if the sheep get lost. Divadai by tnufa. For sure you're going to need to do tnufa again. Why? Because the sheep are the main part. They're the matir, right? They're the ones that basically permit the bread to be eaten. So we can understand why if the sheep get lost, that you would have to redo the tnufa, the waving. Ki tibayalach avad alechem. But he only asked the question if the bread gets lost. And there's no question really according to Ben Nanas, because Ben Nanas was very clear. What did he say? The key is the kvasim and the bread is not so important. So Damar kvasimikar, you said the kvasim are the main thing. So therefore, obviously, you don't have to re-wave the bread. But the question is according to Rabbi Kiva, he said the bread is the main thing. What do we say? Since the lechem is the central thing, you need to wave it. Or maybe we say, look, in the end, what permits the bread? It's the sheep. So even though the bread is essential, but also the sheep is what permits the bread to be eaten. So maybe lo sarich tnufa. Maybe you don't need to re-wave the bread. And teku, we're left with, most Rabbi Yirmiyah questions are left without an answer. Amar le Abaye le Rava. Abaye says to Rava now, Ma'ishna shnei kvasim demakache lechem u'ma'akvei. Now we just said that the bread, right, when you slaughter those two sheep, it sanctifies the bread, and then they're essential, right? You can't have one without the other. So we get back to this. All the other sacrifices that are brought with the bread as well, the 7 sheep and the 1 par and the 2 bulls, the 2 rams, the 1 bull and the 2 rams, why does the slaughtering of those not sanctify the bread? And why are they not essential in this process? So we're going to have 3 answers. Each time we're going to reject one and end up with a third. Amarle. So Abaye asked Rava, and Rava answers him, Ho'il v'huz kekuz elizabeth tnufa. He said, look, it's the tnufa that connects them, and you don't wave all the other animals with it, you only wave the 2 sheep. That's why. So the Gemara says, or maybe Abaye rejects it and says, V'harei toda de lo huz kekuz elizabeth tnufa makachu ma'akva. But wait. If we draw the parallel to the Korban Toda, where we have slaughtering an animal also sanctifies the bread, and then if that's the case, there's no waving there. It can't be the waving that does it, because there's waving, and there's no waving, and yet the slaughtering of the animal sanctifies the bread. So you can't say it's the waving. Okay, so let's try again. Ela kitoda. Maybe it's like a toda. Toda is the paradigm. What do we say by a toda? Ma toda shlamim, apachinami shlamim. In other words, just like a toda, where the bread, now we're going to say, well, everyone knows that the bread gets sanctified when the animal is slaughtered in the toda. So why don't we say, look, that's a shlamim, this is the shlamim, same law for both. To which the Gemara says, midami, these are not the same. Hatam lekas vachim acharine bahade. Hacha ikas vachim acharine bahade. Likachu hane bahane. It's very obvious that it's not like the toda in this way, because a toda has 1 animal and breads. So the 1 animal slaughtered sanctifies the breads. But this has many animals that go with it. So why are you going to say just the 2 sheep and not all the others? So you can't learn it from the toda because that's not a fair comparison. So in the end, he's going to bring a third answer, Rava. Ela ke'el nazil. Ma el nazil. So now we're going to find a parallel where there's bread and there's multiple sacrifices, and it's only one of them that does it, okay, that sanctifies the bread. It's the nazir. The nazir brings a shlamim, an ola, and a chatat. Now, Ke'el Nazir. Ma el Nazir. Now there it's the shlamim. Af agav de'ikas vach machrini, even though there's other sacrifices, shlamim hu demakadshe, midachrini lo. It's the el Nazir, the ram that you bring as a shlamim, is the one that sanctifies, nothing else. Hachinami lo shnasa, we'll say the same thing here. It's just the shlamim and not what all the other ones are korbanot olah. They don't do it. Now, what we have to figure out, which we haven't explained, is how do we know by the el Nazir that that's the case? Hataminalam, where do we get it from? Titania, it says in a Braita. Ve'ta'ayel ta'aseh zevach shlamim la'Hashem al salamatzot. So it says, bring the ram as a zevach shlamim to God with the sal matzot. So what do you see here? Melamed shasal ba'chova la'ayel u'shchitat ayel mekadeshan. We learn from here, first of all, it says zevach shlamim, that means the slaughtering of it. So that the matzot come together with the breads come together with the shlamim, and the slaughtering of the shlamim sanctifies it. Lefichach, one last line here before we get to the last section. Therefore, shchato shelo lishmo lo kitsho alechem. Therefore, let's say you slaughter it for the sake of the wrong korban. Well, then the bread is not sanctified because you messed up the slaughtering, so then it doesn't work. Okay. That was, again, Rabbi's question to Rava. Why are only the two kvasim are the ones that sanctify and not all the other sacrifices? And we learned it from the El Nazir after two other failed attempts. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, last section for today. Today is going to be all figuring out, the rest of the section is all figuring out this one line in this Braita. Shtei alechem haba'ot b'fnei atzmam. What if you bring two loaves by themselves? Because you don't have sheep. And we said sheep don't malkeh, right? They're not essential. If you have them and then and you wave them or you slaughter, then already it's a problem. But if it's an earlier stage, you just don't have sheep, so you bring the breads on their own. Well, what do you do with them? Yunfu, you wave them. And now you would expect that you could eat them. But what does it say here? You have to wait till they get ruined, so to speak, which usually means wait till the next morning. They start to go bad already, and then go out and burn them. Okay. This is a bit of a strange thing. Manavshach, either which way you look at it, it doesn't make sense. If the Torah is telling us, bring them anyway, even without the sheep, for the purpose of eating them, well then we should be able to eat them, not have to burn them. Lechlinu, we should eat them. And if they're coming to be burned, meaning the Torah says, bring them but burn them, because I won't let you eat them, well then lisrafinu la'alter, we should burn them right away. Lamalu ibor tzula, why do you have to wait till the next morning? It doesn't make any sense. So we're going to have two answers, and within the two answers, we're going to also go off on a little bit of a different track. So you'll see. We're going to have Rabba and Rav Yosef mainly. So Amar Rabba, and then Abaye and Rava are going to pipe in. Amar Rabba, la'olam la'achila atyan. Really, they're meant for eating. So why do you burn them? Gezerah shema yizdamnu lahem tfasim l'shana haba. What's the problem? This is a great classic case of Gezerah. We're worried that maybe next year they'll find sheep. And v'yomru, and they'll say, eshteke, last year I remember. Lo, but what do we remember? You don't remember so well. It happened a year ago. Lo achalnu lechem belo kfasim. Did we not eat the bread even without the sheep? Achshav nami nechol. So why don't we eat the bread even before we slaughter the sheep? As you'll get confused, you'll think, because remember, the slaughtering of the sheep is what, first of all, sanctifies the bread and then also permits it to be eaten. Right, the finishing of the slaughtering process. So, but maybe we don't need that because last year we were able to eat the bread without the sheep being slaughtered. Ve'inu lo yadem, they don't remember to eshke lo havu kvasim inu shariya nafshayu. Right, they didn't remember that they had sheep, and that's why they permitted the meat to be eaten. Hashadi kvasim udeshari lehu. But now that there's sheep, it's the sheep that permit it, not the other way around. I just want to also go back and explain a little bit. Why would you be able to eat or not be able to eat? So normally you have the sheep and the slaughtering of the sheep and the doing the whole process, sprinkling the blood permits the meat to be eaten. The question is, what if there's no sheep? So do we go, and this is really what the question is, do we say, well, listen, there's no sheep, so you can bring the bread still, but there's no matir, there's nothing to permit it, so you can't eat the bread at all. You have to burn it. That's not what Rabbah is saying. The other option is to say, well, it doesn't need a matir. Okay? It needs a matir when there's something to matir it, to permit it. But when there's nothing to permit it, you can permit it without it. And then that's exactly what Rabbah is saying. You really don't need, right? You could permit it without it when there's no sheep. But when there are sheep, you can't. And therefore, we're worried that people will think, oh, last year we ate it that way. Maybe they'll think this year you could as well. Now, before we go on to the other opinion, Rabbah is going to explain, how do I know that they're meant for eating? This is going to be a little complicated. I'm a Rabba Menamina, but it's going to reference a Mishnah in Shkalim that we learned earlier in our Masechet on Daf Kaf Daled. Ditnan. It says in the Mishnah, Daf Kaf Aleph. Ditnan. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, He ben Buchri b'yavne kol kohen sheshokel eno chotei. So first, Ben Buchri says, any kohen who gives a machatzit shekel is not a sinner, meaning you can do it if you want. You don't have to, but you can. Optional. Amar lo Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, lo, ki ela kol kohen she'eno shokel chotei. If you don't give the machatzit shekel, you're sinner. And he goes on to say, Ela shekohanim dorshim mikra ze latzmam. The kohanim mistakenly think that they can't give the machatzit shekel. Why? They say, V'chol minchat kohen kalil tiyeh lo te'achel. Any mincha of a kohen has to be completely burnt. Ho'il v'omer ushtei alechem alechem apanim shelanu hen he'ach nechalim. And now, there's certain communal offerings. If we give the money, we're going to be members, we're going to be owners of that korban. And then those mincha korbanot, the omer, the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim, are going to have to be burned. But the Torah says they're supposed to be eaten, right? So how could they be eaten if we give the money? Because then they're ours and they have to be burned completely. So it must be we don't have to give the money. Now, they're wrong about that. But anyway, the point for our purposes is, right, because in the end, it becomes communal property. But Hanishtei lechem hechidami. Now we're going to understand a little differently than we did earlier. We assumed the shtei lechem was shtei lechem the regular, which comes together with 2 sheep. If you want to say it's the ones that come with the 2 sheep, Achu toda ulachma milo minadve kohanim va'achle lehu. But wait, keep making this comparison to the toda. The toda also comes with loaves. Did you ever hear the case of a kohen who can't bring a korban toda or can't eat the breads because they have to be burnt completely? No, it never says that. So what do you see here? The kohen can bring a korban with a mincha, which is the loaves, and the loaves don't get burned completely. So what do you see? It can't possibly be we're talking about a regular situation, because if the toda, the breads, can be brought even though they're owned by kohanim, then also when they're brought with the animal, also here, when they're brought with the animal in the normal way, the kohanim should be able to eat them. And the kohanim couldn't have possibly made a claim like that. It must be, it's talking about some outlier case, a case where they come on their own. And when they come on their own, it's purely a mincha offering. And that's when the kohanim were worried that it's going to be completely burned. And they say, but it's not completely burned because the Torah says even when they come on their own, they get eaten. And what does that prove? We better stay away from this because if we pay for them, they're going to be ours and they're going to have to be burned. And then, what does it say? And after that long-winded argument, what do you see here? The shtei alechem that come by themselves, assuming that's what this Mishnah is talking about, the shtei alechem that come by themselves have to be, right, can be eaten. That's what the kohanim are saying. The fact that they are eaten shows that we're wrong. Okay? So that we shouldn't pay. So now, what do we see here? This was Rabba's way of proving that from by Torah law, okay, before we had this Gzera D'Rabbanan, by Torah law they're meant for eating. Why do we have to burn them? Well, because we're worried about this Gzera. Now, what's the tu bar tzuratan then? Well, if you're going to burn something that's not really ruined because it's actually supposed to be eaten, but we're going to burn it because of a gzera, well, you have to wait till it gets ruined. You can't just burn kochim without having them rot first. Okay, that was all Rabbah. So Rabbah had 2 parts. One to say it's all about eating, and then what's the reason why tu bar tzuratan, that we explained. And then how do I know it gets eaten? Now Abai is going to have a problem with this proof of Rabbah. And later, at the very end of the sugya, we're going to come back to Rava, who brings a different explanation for how we know from the Torah that it actually could be eaten by Torah law before the gzera kicks in, but only later. So Amalei Abai is going to reject this proof, the second part of Rava's words. Lo olam b'ba'otim hazevach. Who's to say the Mishnah is talking about when it comes on its own, and then it has no bearing for our purposes? No, it's talking about when it comes together with a sacrifice. Now, what was the problem? We questioned it from the Toda. Okay, this is at least third comparison today. We're making a comparison to the Toda. Sometimes we said they're similar, and sometimes we said, well, they're not really the same, right? In the end, we said they're not the same in many ways, this way also. Nobody ever called the lachmei toda mincha. They would never call them mincha. So, but shtei halechem ikru mincha, shneimar b'akrivchem mincha chadasha laHashem. The shtei halechem are mincha. It calls them a mincha in the Torah. So the kohanim had a legitimate claim for the regular case of shtei halechem because it's a mincha. But you can't say, oh, you couldn't have asked that in a regular case because look at the Toda, because the Toda is not a mincha. And then it wouldn't be under the category of any mincha has to be burnt completely. So Abai rejects that second part of Rabbah, which was his proof for how do I know that it's meant to be eaten by the Torah. Now comes Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef Amar L'Olam L'Sreifa, and they really should be burned. Okay, and then the question is, then why don't we burn them right away? Well, Hanutama de lo sarfina, and this is answer number 1 here. Lefisha ain't sarfin kodshim b'Yom Tov, because it's on Shavuot, and you don't burn kodshim on Yom Tov. So Amar Abai says, what are you talking about? Midami, that's not the same. Kodshim that get ruined don't get burned on Yom Tov, because it's not like there's a mitzvah to burn them, it's just they got ruined, so wait till tomorrow and burn them. But Hatam, right? Love mitzvah tam b'kaf. That's not the way to do the mitzvah, is to burn kodshim. That's just if they got disqualified, you're stuck with them and, burn them, but don't do it on Yantim. Hacha de mitzvah tam b'kaf l'srafinu. But what we're saying here is, in a case where you're supposed to bring the bread by itself, the Torah says you're supposed to burn it. So that's its mitzvah. That's a fulfillment of a mitzvah. You should be able to do it on Yom Tov. So that's not a good reason to say you have to wait till tomorrow. Midi dahavi, and they just give us a proof of that, like the Parvus Yoshel Yom Kippurim, where it's a mitzvah to do it, and you do it even on the holiday. Because that's what that animal is supposed to be burned, so you burn it on the holiday, and this one also. So now we're going to have what I call 2b. This is answer 2 about the Sreifa, not La'achila. And now, well, what was the reason? His first reason didn't work, so now we're going to go to 2b. Ela Amar Abai, Gzera Shemigistamnu Lem Kvasim La'achar Mikein. The reason why we don't burn the breads right away is because maybe throughout that day, you'll find sheep. You don't have sheep right now, but maybe you'll get sheep, and then you can bring them. So let's just wait. Okay, it's like a waiting game. So Amar Abai then pipes in again with the difficulty. Tinach kol zman akravatan lebatar hachi l'srafinu. Well, then you should only push it off until the nighttime, when you can't no longer bring sacrifice. Why does it say tu bar tzuratam, which usually means till the next morning? So they say, "My tu bar tzuratam nami dikatani tzurat akravatan." He re-explains the words tu bar tzuratam. They're not used in their normal way. It means until their form cannot be sacrificed anymore. He used the words tu bar tzurato, the tzura, the way in which it's brought, the way in which it's sacrificed, can't be done anymore, which means nighttime. Okay, so he changes the meaning of it to work out with his opinion. So that was 2b, because that was basically Rav Yosef's second interpretation as to why we have to wait for tu bar tzuratan. Now we're going to go back to Rava, not back to Rava. We're going to Rava, which is back to Rava's interpretation. Rava said they were given for eating purposes. So then the question was, and because of the Gzera, the question was, how do you know they were given for eating purposes? So Rava tried to prove from that Mishnah in Shkalim, which didn't really work out because Abai contradicted him or knocked him out. But now, so this is like 1b. So comes Rava, and Rava says, "La'achila atyan u'gzera mishum de Rava." I agree with Rava about the reason. Bilav mita'amei alamidikha. But I don't think it comes as proof that it's really la'achila by Torah law. It's not from what he says. I have a pasuk to prove it, and this is a much easier drasha. He says, "Amar Rava menami and Allah." So what's my source for this? Tichtibi moshvotechem taviu lechem tnufa bikurim la'Hashem. Bring lechem. And it calls it bikurim. So what does it say? We're going to make a comparison between the lechem and the bikurim. Ma bikurim, those are the first fruits. B'fnei atzmam, they come by themselves. They don't come with other animals. Af shtei lechem bayim b'fnei atzmam. Also, you can bring the shtei lechem in a pinch, right? If you have no sheep, bring it by itself. Umina, we're going to learn it completely from bikurim. Ma bikurim la'achila, af shtei lechem nami ba'achila. Just like bikurim you can eat, also the shtei lechem are given to be eaten. There you have it, that you can eat them. So again, we have these, if we just summarize, before we summarize the whole daf, we'll just start with this last part. We started with this breita, shtei alechem, that come by themselves, get waved, and then you have to wait till they get ruined, or wait till something, we had different interpretations, something tu bar tzuratan, and then burn them. Why? Either by Torah law, they can really be eaten, but we have to burn them because of this zera, and then since they're kodshim, you can't just burn them, you have to wait till they get ruined. And then we had two possible sources in the Torah. How do we know that by Torah law they can be eaten? Then we have Rav Yosef who says, no, they really meant to be burned. Why? Well, he tried one answer, then he explained in the end, it's really because why? 1 second. Why? Sorry. They're really supposed to be burned, which he doesn't really prove why, but he says they're really supposed to be burned. Why? You have to wait, either because Ein Sofim Kodshim B'Yom Tov, which we rejected. In the end, he changes it to, really, you just have to wait till nighttime because maybe sheep will show up. Okay, you'll find sheep and you'll be able to bring it. So don't throw it out now. Don't burn it yet until you know for sure by the end of that day you're not going to have sheep. Okay, that was the last part. Okay, let's go back to the beginning now. Rabbi Yochanan had started with those two opinions, Rabbi Akiva and Ben Nanas, but they both agree that at a later stage, which then we had a whole question, but is it snufa or is it shchita? Already they're huskaku zelazeh, they have zika, they have this connection between them, and then they actually are ma'akev zeh. You can't have one without the other. And then we had difficulty on snufa one, we resolved it. We had a difficulty on the shlita one, we resolved it. Then Rabbi Yirmiyah had his question about what if you did the snufa and then you lost the bread, would you have to re-wave the bread or not? And then he said, I didn't ask my question about the sheep. That's because it was obvious that you wouldn't, that if you lost the sheep, you would have to wave them again, but I asked about the bread. Okay, and I really only asked according to Rabbi Akiva, because according to Ben Nanas, it would be obvious you wouldn't have to re-wave it. And then the last thing to review is Abaye and Rava and their discussion about why the Shnei Kfasim is what's Ma'akev and is what sanctifies it and then becomes Ma'akev, the breads, and not all the other sacrifices. And we tried to learn it from the waving, that didn't work. We tried to learn it from the Toda, that didn't work. And then we tried to learn it from the El Nazir, and that was successful. With that, we finished today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day.